The old star map on the wall had not been touched in 50 years. Dust sat thick on its edges, and nobody in the coalition chamber liked to look at it, because it still showed the borders from before the silent war, back when things made sense. Today, that map was pulled down and thrown onto the table, and everyone in the room stared at it like it had betrayed them. Councillor Rel Tamsin stood near the window of the high chamber, watching the traffic of ships move slowly across the orbit of the coalition's capital world. She was tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind that came from watching bad news arrive every single day for months. She turned back to the room when the doors opened and General Doran Vask walked in, his feathers ruffled and his eyes dark with worry. "They hit Corin's gate," Doran said, not bothering with formality. 60 ships, gone in under an hour." The room fell silent. Corin's gate was not a small colony. It had shipyards, defense platforms, and nearly 2 million people. If it had fallen that fast, then the thing eating its way through coalition space was worse than anyone wanted to admit. The enemy did not have a name that made sense to anyone. Scout reports simply called it the Swarm, a mass of machines that were not built by any hands, but grew and multiplied on their own, taking apart planets and ships alike and turning them into more of itself. Every weapon fired at it seemed to teach it something. Every battle made it stronger. Fleets that fought it once could not fight it again, because by the second encounter, the Swarm had already learned how to beat them. Rel walked to the center table and looked down at the reports. Numbers, casualty lists, system names that used to belong to someone. She had spent her whole life as a diplomat, trained to find peaceful answers, trained to believe that no problem was too big for careful words and patience. But patience did not work on something that could not be reasoned with. "We are losing," she said quietly, "not slowly, fast." Doran nodded. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been a year since she had last seen him. "The Draveth fleet is gone. The Osuni have pulled back to their inner worlds and are refusing to send more ships outward. Everyone is protecting what they have left instead of fighting for what is still out there." "And the human sector?" someone asked from the far end of the table. It was Carson Bell, a young and ambitious delegate from the Osuni homeworld, his voice sharp with disdain even now. "Still hiding behind their wall, I assume." Doran turned to him slowly. "The human sector," he said, "has not lost a single system to the Swarm." That got everyone's attention. "How is that possible?" Rel asked. "Because the Swarm has not reached them yet," Doran said, "but my scouts say it will within the year, and when it does, I do not think we will be able to help them, not the way things stand now." The room erupted into arguing voices. Some delegates insisted that humanity's isolation was a blessing, proof that the quarantine had been the right choice all along. Others pointed out that if the strongest species in the galaxy were already falling, humanity's luck would not last either. Rel said nothing for a long while, letting the noise wash over her, thinking about the map on the table and the borders that no longer meant anything. She remembered the stories, the ones told to children across a dozen worlds, about a species that had once destroyed an entire war fleet rather than surrender a single ship. She remembered the fear in her own mother's voice when she spoke of the silent war, the way she would lower her voice even though humanity was locked away, far beyond any border, unable to hear a word of it. Rel had grown up believing humans were something close to monsters, patient only in their cruelty, dangerous the moment they were given room to move. But she had also grown up believing the coalition could handle anything. That belief was dying quickly in this room. "There is another option," Doran said finally, when the arguing had quieted enough for him to be heard. "We lift the quarantine. We ask the humans for help." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. Carson Bell laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. "You want to invite the monster into our home because a worse monster is already inside it." "I want to survive," Doran said. "I do not care what shape the hand is that pulls us out of the fire." Rel looked at the star map again, at the old borders drawn by fear instead of reason. She thought about how easy it had been for 300 years to let humanity remain a story instead of a people, a shape in the dark that nobody had to actually look at. I will go, she said suddenly, surprising even herself. Every eye in the room turned to her. If the council agrees to send an env, I will be the one to go. Doran studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then we vote, he said, and turned back to the room full of frightened, arguing leaders, all of them about to decide whether fear or survival would win. The vote took 3 hours. In the end, survival won, but only barely. Rel left the chamber that night with a single order in her hand and a heavy, uncertain feeling in her chest. She was going to a place no coalition diplomat had set foot in for 3 centuries, to ask for help from the one species everyone had spent generations learning to fear. She did not know, as her ship left orbit, that she was about to learn how wrong that fear had always been. The jump gate to human space had not been used in so long that its old activation codes had to be rebuilt from historical archives, pieced together like something from an ancient dig site rather than a working piece of technology. Rel Tamsin sat quietly in her small HFY ship as the gate flickered to life around her, wondering if she was about to be the first coalition citizen in 300 years to see human territory or the last person to see anything at all. The gate held, her ship passed through, and the stars on the other side looked no different than the stars she had left behind. That surprised her somehow. She had expected something wrong with the sky itself, some sign of the danger she had been raised to believe waited on the other side. What she found instead was traffic, lots of it. Cargo haulers, patrol ships, mining platforms, all moving with the kind of order that came from decades of practice, not desperation. It did not look like a species hiding in fear behind a wall. It looked like a civilization that had simply been left alone to grow. Her escort, 2 sleek human fighters, appeared on either side of her ship without warning, matching her speed exactly. A voice came over the comm, flat and businesslike. Unidentified coalition vessel, you are entering Aldrith space. State your purpose or turn back now. Rel's hands were steady, though her heart was not. I am Councillor Rel Tamsin, envoy of the Coalition of Worlds. I request permission to meet with your leadership. I come with an urgent matter concerning the survival of both our peoples. There was a long pause, long enough that Rel began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. Follow us in, the voice finally said. Don't do anything stupid. Aldrith Station was larger than she expected, a massive ring of metal and light hanging in orbit around a pale blue world. As her ship docked, Rel braced herself for hostility, for suspicion, maybe even for violence. What she found instead was Fleet Commander Halden Reyes, standing at the docking bay with his arms crossed, flanked by a handful of guards who watched her without saying a word. Halden was not what she expected either. She had pictured something closer to the monsters of old stories, wild-eyed and eager for a fight. Instead, she saw a tired man in a worn uniform, grey at the temples, with the kind of stillness that came from carrying too much for too long. So, Halden said, looking her over, the Coalition finally remembers we exist. I understand your anger, Rel said carefully. No, Halden said, you don't, not yet. He led her through the station without another word, past workshops and hangars filled with ships that did not match anything in Coalition records. New designs, new weapons, things built quietly over centuries by a species that had never once stopped preparing for a fight it hoped would never come. You built all of this, Rel said quietly, while we assumed you were falling apart out here. We built all of this, Halden said, because we knew nobody was coming to help us if we didn't. The Coalition made that very clear the day they sealed the border and walked away. Rel said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound hollow. They stopped in a wide observation deck overlooking the station's shipyards. Rel could see hundreds of vessels being fitted with weapons she did not recognize, hulls reinforced with materials that did not match any Coalition alloy. It was not the arsenal of a species preparing for conquest. It was the arsenal of a species that expected, one day, to be forced to fight for its life with nobody else beside it. We are being attacked, Rel said finally. A machine species we call the Swarm. It has already destroyed 2 of our largest fleets and consumed entire systems. It grows stronger every time it fights. Nothing we have used against it has worked twice. Halden's face did not change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. And you came here because you're desperate. Yes, Rel said honestly. I came here because you are the only species left who might actually be able to help us, and because if the swarm finishes with us, it will come here next, and you will be alone, exactly like you were left alone before. Halden was quiet for a long moment, staring out at his shipyards, at the fleet his people had spent 300 years building in silence. You people locked us out because you were afraid of what we might become, he said slowly. Funny thing is, you were the ones who taught us that nobody was coming to save us, so we made sure we'd never need saving. I know, Rel said. I am asking anyway. Halden turned to look at her fully for the first time, studying her the way a soldier studies an unfamiliar weapon, trying to decide if it was safe to trust. I'm not the one who decides this, he said finally. The Colonial Assembly will vote, but I'll tell you this much, Counselor, if we help you, it won't be because we've forgiven you. It'll be because it's the smart thing to do. Rel nodded slowly, understanding that this was the best answer she was going to get. As Halden led her deeper into the station, toward the chamber where humanity's leaders were already gathering to hear her plea, she found herself thinking that maybe the stories she had grown up with had never been about monsters at all. Maybe they had only ever been about a species that had learned, the hard way, exactly how alone it truly was. News of the coalition envoy spread through Aldrich Station faster than anyone could control. By the time Rel Tamsin stood before the Colonial Assembly, word had already reached every deck, every workshop, every mining crew out in the belts. People stopped their work just to listen to the broadcast, some out of curiosity, most out of anger. The assembly chamber was nothing like the grand halls of the coalition capital. It was practical, built for function rather than beauty, rows of seats filled with representatives from every human colony still standing. Rel stood at the center of it, feeling smaller than she had in years, painfully aware that every person in that room had grown up hearing stories about people like her sealing their ancestors away and leaving them to survive or die alone. Colonel Inez Draper was the first to speak after Rel finished her plea. She was a sharp-featured woman with a voice that cut through the room like a blade. Let me understand this, she said, standing slowly. For 300 years, the Coalition wanted nothing to do with us. They called us monsters. They taught their children to fear us. And now that something is finally strong enough to threaten them, they remember we exist. A murmur of agreement rolled through the chamber. I am not here to defend what was done, Rel said. I am here because I believe both our peoples will die if we do not act together. Convenient, Draper said, that the survival of your people suddenly requires the help of the ones you locked away. Rel held her ground, though her chest felt tight. You are right to be angry, I would be angry too, but the swarm does not care about old grudges, it does not care about borders or history, it only consumes. If it finishes with coalition space, it will not stop at your border, it will come here next, and by then you will be facing it entirely alone, with no one left to help you in return. Toby W. Tran, a young engineer sitting near the back with grease still on his hands from the shipyards, stood up before Draper could respond. He looked nervous, unused to speaking in front of so many people, but his voice was steady. She's right about one thing, he said. We've been building ships for a war we hoped would never come, but we built them assuming we'd be facing it alone eventually. If the swarm wipes out the coalition first, it'll hit us with everything it's already learned fighting them. We'd be facing an enemy that already knows how we might fight back, because it will have studied every alien tactic in the galaxy by then. And if we help them, Draper shot back, we lose ships and lives fighting someone else's war, for people who will forget the debt the moment it's paid. Maybe, Toby said, or maybe we get allies for the first time in 300 years, instead of an empty border and a species that only remembers we exist when they need something. The chamber broke into arguing voices, some agreeing with Draper's anger, others leaning toward Toby's practical hope. Rel stood quietly through all of it, understanding that this was not her decision to make. She had done what she came to do. Now it was up to the people she had once been taught to fear. Halden Reyes, who had been standing silently near the front of the chamber through the entire debate, finally raised a hand for quiet. The room settled slowly, out of respect more than obedience. "I've buried more people than I can count defending our space," he said, "alone, while the coalition sat behind their border, pretending we didn't exist. I have every reason in the world to tell this envy to go home and let the coalition deal with the mess they built for themselves." He paused, looking out over the room. "But I've also seen what happens to an enemy that's allowed to grow unchecked. If the swarm eats through coalition space, it will be stronger, smarter, and closer to our border by the time it reaches us. We won't be facing the same threat they're facing now. We'll be facing something worse, and we'll be facing it without a single ally in the galaxy." He looked directly at Rel. "This isn't about forgiveness. I want to be very clear about that. This is about survival. If we vote to help, it's because it's the smartest move for humanity, not because we've suddenly decided to trust the people who locked us away." The assembly called for a vote shortly after. Rel waited outside the chamber while the count was taken, packing slowly along a viewport that looked out over Aldrich Station's endless rows of docked ships. She thought about the star map back home, about the old borders that had shaped so much fear on both sides for so long. When Halden finally came to find her, his face was unreadable. "It's close," he said, "but we are in. The fleet mobilizes within the week." Relief washed through Rel so suddenly that she had to steady herself against the viewport's edge. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Halden said. "This isn't a gift, counselor. It's a partnership, whether the coalition likes it or not, and partnerships go both ways." He studied her for a moment longer. "Let's just hope your people remember that once this is over." Rel nodded slowly, understanding the weight behind his words. As she watched the shipyards below begin to stir with new activity, fleets being prepared for a war that was not originally theirs, she allowed herself, for the first time since Corin's gate had fallen, to feel something close to hope. Corvin Reach had once been a quiet mining colony, the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to be left alone. Now it sat directly in the path of the Devourer swarm, and it was about to become the site of the first battle in history where human and coalition ships fought side by side. Rel Tamsin stood on the bridge of Halden Reyes' command ship, watching the tactical display fill with red markers representing the approaching swarm. There were so many that the display struggled to render them individually, eventually giving up and showing a single pulsing red mass instead. It looked less like an enemy fleet and more like a disease spreading across the screen. "Numbers?" Halden asked without turning around. "Still counting," an officer replied grimly. "Past 4,000 contacts a minute ago. It hasn't stopped growing." Around Corvin Reach, the joint fleet spread into formation. Coalition ships held to their usual careful positioning, built around coordinated defense and gradual retreat if needed. Human ships did something different, something that made several coalition officers on the shared command channel visibly uneasy. They pushed forward, aggressive and close, positioning themselves as if retreat was not a concept their tactics accounted for at all. "Your ships are too close together," a coalition fleet officer warned over the comm. "If the swarm breaches your formation, you'll have no room to fall back." "We're not planning on falling back," Halden replied simply and cut the channel. Rel glanced at him. "Is that wise?" "The swarm learns," Halden said. "Every time it fights the same tactics, it gets better at beating them. Coalition ships have been falling back and regrouping in every battle so far, and it's working out badly. We're doing something it hasn't seen before." The first wave of swarm ships arrived minutes later, a storm of small, insect-like machines that moved with unsettling precision, breaking formation and reforming constantly to avoid incoming fire. Coalition weapons, tuned to standard energy frequencies, sliced through the first few waves easily, only for the swarm to adjust almost instantly, shifting its hull composition to resist the exact frequencies being used against it. "They're adapting," a coalition officer said, panic creeping into his voice. "Already." "Let them adapt to this," Halden said, and gave the order. Human ships opened fire with weapons the swarm had never encountered before, systems built in complete isolation from Coalition standards over 300 years, using materials and frequencies that matched nothing in any known database. For the first time in the entire war, the swarm's ships did not adapt fast enough. They began, slowly at first, then more clearly, to actually die. A cheer went up briefly across the Coalition channel before the battle turned worse than anyone expected. The swarm's numbers were simply too great, and even weapons it could not immediately counter began wearing down under sheer volume. Ships on both sides started taking damage. Rel watched as a Coalition cruiser near the edge of the formation lost power entirely, drifting helplessly as smaller swarm ships closed in around it like predators sensing weakness. "We are losing the Draveth cruiser," an officer called out. "No shields, no weapons, it's a sitting target." Halden's jaw tightened. He looked at the tactical display for only a second before making his decision. Redirect the Hollies and the Farron, have them cut a path to the cruiser and pull the crew out, then blow the ship. "Sir, the Hollies and Farron won't survive contact with that many swarm ships at once." "They'll survive long enough," Halden said. "Do it." Rel watched, her hands gripping the edge of the console, as two human ships broke formation and drove directly into the mass of swarm vessels surrounding the dying cruiser. It was reckless, almost suicidal by Coalition standards, but it worked. The two ships tore a path through the swarm long enough for evacuation pods to launch from the crippled cruiser, and then, following Halden's order without hesitation, the abandoned ship's reactor was detonated, taking a wide section of the surrounding swarm cluster with it. It was not a clean victory. The Hollies limped away with half its hull torn open. The Farron did not make it back at all. Rel felt the loss settle over the bridge like a heavy weight, and she understood, watching Halden's face carefully, that this was not the first time he had made a choice like this, and it would not be the last. "You lost a ship to save one cruiser," Rel said quietly. "I lost a ship to prove something works," Halden said, his voice flat with exhaustion rather than coldness. "The swarm needed to see that hitting an isolated target costs it more than it gains. It'll remember that. Maybe it'll think twice next time." The battle raged for nearly 6 more hours before the swarm, having taken heavier losses than in any previous engagement across the war, finally began to withdraw. It was not destroyed, not even close, but for the first time since the war began, it had retreated rather than pressed forward. Corvain Reach held. Rel stood on the bridge amid the quiet aftermath, watching damage reports scroll past, watching the names of the dead being read out over the comm by voices too tired to carry proper grief yet. She thought about everything she had been taught about humanity, the stories of cruelty and monstrous patience, and she realized, watching Halden quietly speak with his crew about the ship they had lost, that none of it had ever been about cruelty at all. It had only ever been about a species willing to make the hardest choice in the room, because nobody had ever been willing to make it for them. Victory, it turned out, could be just as dangerous as defeat. Within days of the battle at Corvain Reach, news of the human fleet's success spread across every Coalition world, carried by war correspondents eager for any good news after months of losses. For a brief moment, there was celebration. Then, slowly, the celebration curdled into something else entirely. Carson Bell stood before an emergency session of the Coalition Council, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had already decided how the story should end. "The humans destroyed more swarm ships in a single battle than we have in the past 3 months combined," he said. "Does that not concern anyone else in this room?" A few delegates shifted uncomfortably, but nobody spoke. "They fought without hesitation," Carson continued. "They sacrificed one of their own ships without blinking, used tactics no sane commander would risk, and did it all with a kind of calm that should frighten every one of us. This is exactly what the old stories warned us about. We opened the door for exactly the kind of ruthlessness we spent 300 years trying to keep out." Rel Tamsin, watching the session remotely from Aldrich Station, felt her stomach twist with frustration. She requested to speak, and after a tense pause, was granted the floor. "I was there," she said. I watched Commander Reyes lose a ship and its entire crew to save one of our cruisers. That was not ruthlessness. That was sacrifice. If you want to call that frightening, then perhaps it is only frightening because none of us have been willing to make a choice like that ourselves. Convenient words from someone who has clearly grown close to them, Carson said coldly. I have grown close to the truth, Rel snapped back, losing her careful diplomatic tone for the first time in years. The truth is that we are alive because of decisions made by people we spent 3 centuries calling monsters. If that is inconvenient for you, Carson, I suggest you spend a little less time protecting old fears and a little more time thanking the fleet currently keeping the swarm away from your homeworld. The session ended without resolution. The council split between those grateful for humanity's help and those who saw every human success as further proof of old prejudices confirmed rather than disproven. Rel closed the connection feeling drained, and worse, feeling as though the fight ahead might end up being fought on 2 fronts instead of 1. Back on Aldrich Station, things were not much better. The joint fleet had regrouped to prepare for what scouts believed would be an even larger swarm push, this time aimed directly at supply lines feeding both coalition and human territory. Rel found Halden alone in the station's memorial hall, standing before a newly added wall of names, the crew of the Farron among them. She recognized one name near the top of the new list, Captain Myril Okoye, marked as lost in a rearguard action just 2 days prior, protecting a combined convoy during a smaller skirmish that had barely made it into the official reports. I'm sorry, Rel said quietly, coming to stand beside him. She flew with me for 11 years, Halden said, his voice rough. 11 years surviving out here with nothing but each other, and she dies protecting a supply convoy half of which belonged to people who, a few months ago, wouldn't have spat on us if we were on fire. Rel said nothing, understanding there was no comfort she could offer that would not sound hollow. Draper warned me this would happen, Halden continued, said we'd bleed for people who wouldn't remember the cost once the danger passed. Some days, it's hard to argue with her. I know some in my council are already trying to forget, Rel admitted. Carson Bell wants the quarantine reinstated the moment the swarm threat is dealt with. He's convinced your success only proves you were always dangerous. Halden let out a short, humorless laugh. Of course he does. Doesn't matter how many of our people die keeping his world standing. To people like him, we'll always be the monster from the story, no matter what we actually do. Rel felt something harden in her chest. A resolve she hadn't fully recognized in herself until that moment. Then I will make sure he is wrong, she said. I will not let 300 years of fear decide what happens next, not after everything I have seen out here. Halden studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes. Why does it matter so much to you? He asked. You could go home right now, report the victory, let the politics sort themselves out, and never have to fight for people who don't trust you either. Because I have spent my whole life believing the coalition could handle anything on its own, Rel said. I was wrong, and I refuse to let fear cost us the one thing that might actually save us, simply because it makes people uncomfortable to admit they were wrong too. She returned to the coalition capital days later and requested to testify formally before the full council, an unusual and risky move for a diplomat of her rank. She spoke for nearly an hour, describing everything she had witnessed at Corvain Reach and beyond, not the monster of old stories, but a species that had survived alone for 3 centuries and had chosen, despite every reason not to stand beside people who had once locked them away. It did not silence Carson Bell entirely, but it was enough, for now, to keep the quarantine debate from moving any further, and enough to buy the fragile alliance the time it desperately needed. The swarm, meanwhile, was already gathering for its final and largest assault, entirely unconcerned with the politics of the people preparing to face it. The scouts had been wrong about one thing. It was not the supply lines the swarm was after. It was the capital system itself, the beating heart of the coalition, home to its government, its shipyards, and nearly 1 billion lives across a dozen orbital stations. When the true scale of the incoming attack became clear, there was no more room left for politics, No more room for old fears or lingering suspicion. There was only the fight ahead. Rel Tamsin stood in the war room of the Coalition capital, surrounded by officers from a dozen different species, human commanders included for the first time in 300 years, without a single objection raised. The tactical display showed the swarm's approach as a solid wall of red, larger than anything recorded since the war began, converging on the capital from 3 directions at once. "This is everything it has," a Draveth officer said quietly. "It isn't holding anything back." "Then neither will we," Halden Reyes said, standing at the edge of the display, studying the incoming formation with the calm focus Rel had come to recognize as his way of handling fear. He had aged visibly since Corvin Reach. The weight of every loss along the way settled into the lines of his face, but his voice was steady. "We can't win a straight fight against that," he said. "Not with pure numbers. We need it to make a mistake." "It doesn't make mistakes," Carson Bell said from across the room, his earlier hostility now buried under genuine fear. "It adapts. It learns." "Everything that learns can be tricked," Halden said. "It just needs to think the trick is real." His plan was simple in concept and terrifying in execution. The joint fleet would draw the swarm's central hive cluster, the coordinating core that directed the rest of the mass, into the system's dense asteroid belt, where human engineers had spent the past several weeks secretly seeding thousands of adapted mines built using the same unfamiliar materials and frequencies that had worked so well at Corvin Reach. If the hive cluster could be crippled, the rest of the swarm, no longer centrally coordinated, would fracture into smaller, far more manageable groups. It required the joint fleet to hold a losing position long enough to lure the core into the trap, absorbing devastating losses in the process. Several coalition officers objected fiercely, calling it reckless, a gamble built on unproven tactics and desperate hope rather than sound strategy. Rel fought for it anyway, standing before the assembled command staff and reminding them that every option built on caution had already failed. The vote to proceed was unanimous, not because everyone believed it would work, but because nobody had a better idea left. The battle began at dawn by the capital's local clock, though there was no real dawn in the void of space, only the sudden bloom of weapons fire lighting the darkness as the swarm's leading edge made contact with the outer defense line. Rel watched from the command ship as human and coalition vessels fought side by side in a formation neither species would have accepted from the other only months before, human aggression tempered by coalition coordination, coalition caution steadied by human resolve. Losses came fast and brutal. Ships Rel had come to recognize by name over the past months vanished from the display one by one. She forced herself to keep watching, understanding that looking away would not save a single life, only make her less useful to the people still fighting. "Core cluster entering the belt," an officer called out, "bait ships holding position." Halden's voice came steady over the fleet channel, "Hold until my mark, not a second before." The core cluster pushed deeper into the asteroid field, its outer defenses spreading to protect it, exactly as the plan required. Rel held her breath, watching the display, watching thousands of hidden mines sitting silent and waiting among the drifting rocks. "Mark," Halden said. The belt lit up all at once, a chain of explosions tearing through the swarm's core formation faster than its adaptive systems could compensate. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing seemed to change. Then, gradually, the solid red mass on the tactical display began to break apart, smaller clusters scattering without central direction, easier targets for the exhausted but still fighting joint fleet. It took another 4 hours to finish what the trap had started, but by the system's local evening, the last organized swarm formation had been destroyed. What remained scattered into the dark, small and directionless, no longer a true threat to anyone. The capital held. In the days that followed, the Coalition Council convened not to argue about quarantine, but to formally end it. Carson Bell, notably, did not attend the vote. Rel stood beside Halden as the announcement was made, watching the same star map that had once shown 300-year-old borders finally get redrawn, human space folded into the wider galaxy for the first time since the Silent War. "Feels strange," Halden said quietly, watching the new map take shape. All that time we spent preparing to survive alone, never really planned for this part. What part is that? Rel asked. Being welcome somewhere, he said. Rel looked at him, thinking about everything that had happened since she first crossed into human space with nothing but fear and a desperate request. You were never the monster in the story, she said. You were only ever the ones nobody bothered to actually meet. Halden allowed himself something close to a smile, small and tired, but real. Maybe next time, he said, somebody remembers that before it takes a war to figure it out. Above them, human and coalition ships moved together through the newly opened border, no longer strangers separated by fear, but allies standing shoulder to shoulder at the edge of an uncertain but shared future. The galaxy's final hope had not turned out to be a monster at all. It had only ever been a people who had learned, the hard way, exactly what it meant to stand alone, and who had chosen, when finally given the chance, to stand beside someone else instead.